Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Hey, and thanks for listening to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond, and I'm pleased to be joined by pastor and author, Reverend Dr. Katie Hayes. So, hello.
Hi.
Well, thanks for joining us today. And I usually ask my guests or talk to them about how I know them. In this case, I really don't know you at all, and I just kind of admire you from afar. So, tell our listeners, tell me a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure. I grew up in a very small town in Texas, in West Texas, in a fundagelical church and in a really compassionate and kind family. And left all of that as soon as I could. Pursued faith in the only way I knew how. I remained part of that fundagelical church for longer than was rational or psychologically healthy for me, but it just was the way I knew how. And that in that church, my calling to ministry was denied because women don't get ordained in that kind of church. And eventually I made my way to the disciples and then eventually to church planting. And here I am back in Texas where I said I would never live, but I think God is kind of hard of hearing me say anywhere but Texas. And God says, Texas? All right. Yeah.
Well, I love that term fundagelical. I'm guessing that's a mash between fundamentalist and evangelical.
Yeah.
Do you mind sharing what that tradition was?
I was in the Church of Christ, hello, we're the only ones going to heaven, Church of Christ.
Yeah. So for our listeners, Katie and I are both ordained within Disciples of Christ. So you refer to them as disciples. And as I understood it, or as I understand church history, the Church of Christ were kind of liturgical cousins, you might say.
Yeah.
Right?
Theologically speaking, yeah. Historically speaking, we are absolutely cousins. We have the same founders. It's just that because of the principles the denomination in the first place was founded on, half its people went way to the right and half of its people went way to the left. So to move between those two little twigs on the family tree is actually to travel a great distance.
Is indeed. Yeah. It is indeed. I grew up Independent Baptist, so not quite the same, but similar travels, I'll say.
Yeah.
So you alluded to a little bit. Tell me about, if you don't mind, how your experience of growing up in the Church of Christ in the fundagelical tradition, what that looked like in your past and maybe a little bit what it looks like now.
Yeah. I've done a lot of work in therapy and prayer to try to make sense out of my religious upbringing, because there's one way of narrating that story where I am a spiritual refugee myself, where my own full humanity is denied because I'm a woman, where just the dignity and wholeness of the whole Katie is not really celebrated. And you know, there are layers of hurt, bordering on trauma that come from an experience like that growing up.
Yeah.
Where I also really, really, really loved God and kind of wished that I didn't. I mean, if I could have been rid of the whole thing, I would have ditched it a bunch of times in my very young adulthood.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't shake it. I know now that, you know, God was pursuing me with a calling to ministry, but for a long time, I didn't even have language for that. I didn't even know that women ever did that.
Sure.
So to grow up that way and have this deep love of God and the people of God as manifest in the church, even as the church keeps saying, no, we don't want that much of you.
Wow.
We want you, but not that much of you.
Yeah.
That's a story of hurt. And I got a soft underbelly. I mean, people can sort of press that button on me and not even know they've done it. And filled with grief that comes out as rage. On the other hand, there's another way of narrating that story, that I grew up in a congregation of really kind-hearted people who loved me and loved my family and supported my family through some hard things. And my family, parents, siblings, just really dedicated to the life of that congregation. And it was our social circle. And that had been generationally true on both my parents' sides. And so I am really grateful now to that upbringing. It gave me some good things that I carry with me to this day. And I've just had to learn to make peace with the parts of that that were diminishing to me.
Yeah, I think that's I know for me, I've had it, like I said, a similar background, and that was something that I've had to do, is make peace with my past and try to find things, like you said, that I can take from it and value from it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious, was there like a moment where you had like almost like a deconversion or reconversion, or if that makes sense? I know for me, I was taking a class at a state school in religious studies, and I kind of got introduced to all these new ways of thinking about the world and Christianity and the Bible. It kind of just blew my mind, and I said, oh my goodness, there's this whole new way of looking at the world and Christianity. I'm curious if there's something for you had a kind of a pivotal moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a couple. Well, there are many. I've been converted so many times I can't keep track, because God is ever there are more and more little pieces of God that become clear as I go through life and get older, gain altitude, all that. But when I was very young, I went to college to study engineering, and because women could do anything, just not in the church.
Right.
And there was a dorm mate, a friend, who kept disappearing weirdly at different hours of the day. I couldn't understand it. And then I started to understand that there were long seasons of the semester where he wasn't eating food until the sun went down. I could not figure out, where does he go? Why isn't he eating food? Yeah. And it finally became clear to me, this man is Muslim. Yeah. And this man is more devout than I am. And that was a first, because I hadn't ever met anyone more devout in their faith than myself. And here he was practicing prayer on at certain hours. He was withdrawing from social gatherings and from classes to pray in private places in a particular way. He was fasting and fasting and fasting through Ramadan. And I thought, wow, how could that be true? I thought I was the most devout human. I mean, there's a kind of self-righteousness.
Yeah.
So that was just a huge eye-opener for me, that the world is big and God is big. God is very big. And here is this person whom I love. I've just discovered this thing about. Then a couple years later, I had left the study of engineering because I was really terrible at it. I liked it, but it's not the way my brain really works. And I was studying theology, like biblical studies, Christian theology for the first time. And it was such a kick. I just loved it. And I got into a class where the professor it's a class on the Synoptic Gospels. And the professor lectured that day on the historical Jesus. The idea that the Jesus of history and the Jesus of the gospel are not really the same. And that there is a whole field of study out there trying to sort of get behind the stories of the gospels to find out who Jesus of Nazareth, that Palestinian Jew, actually was. And as it dawned on me what he was saying, I got really verklempt. I mean, really like upset, agita in my spirit. And I dashed out of class, down to the bathroom, threw up my lunch.
Wow.
And then came back to class and sat down and started taking notes. And I thought, I am never going to think about things the same again.
Wow.
After that. Yeah.
Wow. It's kind of like this is kind of a cliche image, but it comes to mind for me is kind of the matrix of the red pill and the blue pill. Like,
yes. Yeah.
It's such a cliche metaphor, but for me, it was the same way. Like, you kind of know what you know, and there's no going back.
Yep. That's right.
Well, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thanks,
Katie. Tell me if you can, what does it look like now, maybe, or what contrasts now from your youth, perhaps your understanding of being a Christian?
Oh yeah, it was just such a dogged pursuit in my youth for righteousness, and righteousness included being right. Yeah, being right. Dogmatically speaking, was really, really important because we loved God And my idea about what God loved
Mm-hmm.
is that God loves for us to be right and righteous, to give intellectual assent to the right ideas about God, and that is the pursuit. I've let that go pretty much, though I still am an avid student of the Bible, of theology, of Christian history, of human history. Human being is so interesting to me, and I still I want to exercise my brain in service of my faith, but I am no longer afraid of not having it all right, and I am aware that God is far more interested in my own pursuit of righteousness as a way of being, sort of a longing after God's heart, wanting to want what God wants, which is just really different than just trying to get a list of things exactly right.
What a great contrast. I love that. I know for me, when I was in high school, I kind of had a similar mentality of like, I felt like I was just a prick because I thought like that's what I was supposed to be.
Oh, yeah.
It's just like doing the right thing.
Right.
And that was what a good Christian young man did. So, well, thanks, Katie. I want to get into, I love to hear more kind of about your story in Galileo Church and then how that transformed into your book here. But let's get right into it.
Okay.
Tell me, like, you allude to this in your book. Why start, and I'm talking to you as a church planner myself, why start a new church?
Yeah. Let me just say, I tried for 2 decades as a solo pastor in small congregations, which is the kind I prefer, where people know each other and are really doing life together. And I tried multiple times to do this sort of transformative work where a church that has been around for a while and has a way of doing things and a way of understanding the world and itself, it's aging up. It wants badly to attract, and I'm going to just bracket that word, attract newcomers. And in particular, they want straight, white, educated
young
families, to come in. And I really tried it. I tried it with all the denominational tools. I hired the consultants. I read the books. I did the things. And I just wasn't any good at it. It did not happen in the congregations I served. There were a few times where I felt like, oh, we're really making progress here. We're really moving down a path toward how God wants to use us in this world. But like in one heartbreaking case, it just felt like after I left that church for reasons that had to do with my family and not the church. It was like I had spent all my time there stretching out a rubber band. And as soon as I was gone, it just went right back to the shape it was, which is to say that's not good ministry. I mean, I wasn't really sharing a vision, a mission with the whole church. I was just sort of by sheer force of will making stuff happen. Good. So I tried it. So finally, starting a new church was a way to say, I'm so curious about how communities of trust in Jesus' name could look different. And I think they could be beautiful. And I want to try that. I want to get out on that frontier of spiritual, but not religious, and try to see if I've got any gifts that could be useful there.
Wow. Yeah. That's brave. So I love that look different. Communities of trust in Jesus' name. I love the way you say that. So you took kind of this idea of wanting to do something new, as I'm hearing it, in Jesus' name, looking different, and Galileo Church came out of that. Tell us a little bit about how that happened, how they got rolling.
Wow, it's so amazing. I was just like every pastor in North American mainline Protestant, mostly white Christianity. That's what I know. I want to speak from that context, because that's what I know. Just like all of my colleagues and friends, we were all sitting in our executive style offices behind executive desks, panicking because the pews are not being repopulated by first Gen Xers and then millennials. The Gen Xers left and nobody really minded because there aren't that many of us. But when the millennials didn't come back around after having been abused in youth group and stuff, then we started to panic. And I'm reading all the books and the blog posts and stuff, and I'm thinking, there's something going on. Like, why don't they want what we've worked so hard to preserve for them? And then I realized that I actually knew by luck or by providence, there were some 20-somethings in my life, people that I already had relationships with, but I understood that I didn't understand anything about them. I didn't understand what made them tick, and so I started convening a group a late night, Thursday night group of very young adults, just out of sheer curiosity about them. And I told them, I said, look, I just want to ask you, like, who are you? Why do you get out of bed in the morning? What keeps you awake at night? What are you worried about? What are you excited about? Just tell me about your life. And that turned into a weekly gathering. I was cooking for it and bringing beer. And they were sharing their life with me. And then they were sharing their life with each other.
I understand the food and the beer was a big part of it, right?
Just a big part of it. Yeah.
I mean, 20-something, of course, right? Yeah.
Well, there were people in that group, I'm pretty sure, who never ate any meal that didn't come wrapped in paper or in a styrofoam box.
Yeah.
So to have some home cooking, I'm not that great a cook, but something made out of ingredients in someone's kitchen was kind of a big deal.
And a communal meal.
Yeah. And not in front of a screen.
Yeah.
Not just eating while you're distracted, but really just enjoying with people is a big deal. And that organically and suddenly, and to my surprise, that turned into church. I mean, it just all of a sudden, I looked around and I tell a story in the book about how it happened. But I mean, one night I just realized all of a sudden, like it smacked me in my head, like this is church. What's happening right here, Thursday night, 9 p.m. is actually church.
Yeah.
So, and we started talking about how could we, this group of friends that had been meeting for like, by that time, over a year.
Wow.
What would it look like, we said, what would it look like to sort of break this open in order to make room for more people?
Yeah.
In order to make room for people who are not here yet. And when we got to that idea that there are people who would want this that are not here yet, that little group got on board, not 100% of them, but many of them got on board and said, yeah, okay, let's do it. What do we have to do? What does it take?
That's great. And how long has that been then?
We'll celebrate our 7th birthday on Pentecost. So in a week, like Sunday is our birthday.
Yeah, as we're recording this. I'm wearing red. What kind of red? Pink.
Nice.
Because Pentecost is my favorite time of the church year. And you have kind of red. What color is your hair?
That's pretty pink. Yeah.
Our listeners can't see it, but we'll say it's Pentecostish, right?
Let's say that.
Well, here's what I want to know, Katie, as a church planner, so I can learn from you.
Yeah.
What would you say is your biggest mistake or like your biggest lesson learned?
Yeah.
I mean, I could usually hear both, but you share what you're willing to.
Yeah. I mean, there are concrete things and there are more sort of esoteric things.
Yeah.
Concretely, here's one. For a while, Galileo Church was really mobile. We had to be because we kept getting kicked out of places we rented.
Yeah.
Not because we didn't pay the rent, but because people would figure out what kind of church we were, and then they didn't want us there anymore.
Yep.
And I talked about that because it was necessary at the time as being a real blessing to us. I said, look, God's people have always been light on their feet. God calls us to not get, stuck in one place, but to be ready to travel. Discipleship involves following. Yeah. So it is all good. But the truth is, in retrospect, every time we had to move, our community took a hit. It was hard on us.
Yeah.
It was expensive, like spiritually. And I think part of that is because here we had gathered people who were sort of giving not just church, but in some sense giving faith, giving God one last chance.
Yeah.
And as soon as they found a tiny bit of stability, we'd be like, we're moving. Let's pack it all up. And by the way, I haven't found a new place yet. So pray with me, and that was just bad.
That's my hardest thing about in some of the ministry endeavors I've done is trying to get back those people who are kind of like, I'll give it one more shot. And your heart kind of breaks for those people who you feel like, boy, they've trusted you to give it one more shot. And now.
Yeah. And sometimes that's just circumstances. Yeah.
As a church planner, I do study a lot of evangelical models and teachers. And that's certainly, the evangelicals will say you move, you lose 50%, whether that's, I don't know if there's data behind that, but that's a tough metric. And I'm sure it sounds like you can to speak to that.
Definitely. Yeah.
I'm curious too, what's one thing, if you could go back in time and tell Katie of 2013, 2015, whatever year it was, 2013-ish, what's one thing you would want your old self to know about church planning?
I was not entirely prepared for how much it would change me.
Wow.
I think I would have said in 2013, look, I've accumulated a lot of wisdom, like the kind of experience that comes from making mistakes before and learning to do better. I've got all that under my belt, and I'm really ready to, I'm going to say this just in a crass kind of way. I'm just really ready to help people.
Yeah.
Which is, I'm embarrassed of that now, because the truth is, as it has happened over these years, I am the one who has been helped. And I hate how self-centered that sounds, but I cannot deny the conversion of my own heart in this process. It has really freed me, and I am much better for it.
Wow. That's great. That's great. Well, you've kind of taken all this and you've put this story into a book that you're calling We Were Spiritual Refugees.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, you're telling the story of kind of how Galileo Church came to be, yes? Mm-hmm. So what kind of pushed you, said, hey, I need to put this into a book?
There were a couple things. One was, maybe this happens to you too. I get messages, emails, phone calls from people who say, I heard about your church on Facebook, or I saw it online. I kind of want to do something like that. So tell me, how'd you get started? And I just found that I was sometimes getting into very long conversations, one individual at a time, tell them about different aspects of Galileo Church. It wasn't very systematic. It was just sort of me rambling. It's very inefficient as a way to share. And I realized what they want is what I wanted when I started this whole deal, which is someone just to point me in a direction. Not like a method. And my book is definitely not a method. It's just a deeply personal, contextual particularity. But people were just really hungry to know that it's possible. And have some idea of the contours of the work, what it looks like. So writing the book was partly about that, answering questions that have been asked of me. And then it was also a necessity, as it turned out, for me after 5 years of doing the work nonstop, which was, 70, 80 hours a week sometimes. It was so exhausting, and it was all year long. It was just a lot. I loved it, and that's why I did it so much.
There's not a lot of vacation weeks in church planning.
No, there's really not. Not that my church was demanding that of me. It wasn't that, but that I loved it. I just wanted it. I wanted it. But it meant I never stopped really to reflect what has happened here. What is happening here? How is this changing me? Is it working? I mean, beyond just the weekly metrics of who shows up, in what sense is this good for the world? If it is. So to pause at the 5-year mark just seemed like a smart thing to do, just to get some perspective on what was happening there. Yeah.
Well, that's great. And it sounds like you're kind of alluding to what your goal for the book was to partly to be kind of a teacher and inspiration for others. Anything you want to add to that more?
Yeah, I meet a lot of people from traditional church backgrounds, usually older than myself, who are really, really, really afraid. They're afraid for the church's future. They're afraid for their children's and grandchildren's future. And they're afraid what the world would look like if the church just sort of poofs out of existence. And what I want to say to them is, church as you know it may well poof out of existence. This pandemic may speed that along.
Absolutely.
And yet, God still has people in this world. And God is still sending people into this world imbued with the Spirit of the living Christ to embody love. That is still happening. And they are still gathering in communities of belonging, in communities of practice. And it's church is what it is. It is beautiful. And I want you to see it. I want you to know it's beautiful, and stop being afraid.
Well, I really appreciate what you said there about fear amongst older generations. I think I know for me as a younger person, I should, in our context, I'm considered a younger person. In most contexts, I'm not. In mainline Protestantism, I still consider a younger person. In mainline Protestantism especially, I don't think we talk about enough, this fear of the unknown, of what will, and this fear kind of inhibits people from doing anything because we're so afraid of change. Let's just keep everything the same because that's what we know.
You know what else there is, though, I think, and it partners, it holds hands with that fear. I think there's a lot of shame also. In existing churches that are on the decline, there's a lot of shame that the thing their parents or grandparents built, they have not been able to, gift it to the next generation.
Yeah.
And they're ashamed to let it die on their watch while they are responsible for it. And I don't know the magic potion for relieving that shame and just saying, it's really not your fault. I mean, it is your problem. Like, you're going to have to figure out what to do about it. But we are in a cultural apocalypse here. The church is not the only institution that is suffering.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So everybody's trying to figure out how to bridge between people and form communities of trust.
Mm-hmm.
Churches also.
Yeah, that's great. Great. Shame. Yeah, that's great. So I love what you, this kind of rolls into what I want to talk about next, is your point about the next church.
Yeah.
So tell me what you see as like next church. So we talked about this old model kind of not working anymore for this new kind of culture we're in, and what you see as this next model that you're working on now. And as I understand in the book, kind of what you see is you're still in the now church, as you say, right? You're not sure what the next church totally is.
Well, I think Galileo is out here on the frontier doing a kind of next church, kind of an R&D experiment in a way. I mean, it's very real to those of us who are part of it, but for people who are outside of it, I think they can look to it for data about what next church might look like. I mean, at least to get a whiff of some of the characteristics I think the next church will have. I think the next church will be, for one thing, deeply contextual. And anybody who doesn't know about that already, you just got to catch up. Because this idea, even with our best intentions, when we say things like all are welcome, and all means all, I mean, I get that, and I love that. The disciples certainly welcomed me when I was, in need of welcome. But I think saying all misses the idea that everything is so niche now, and that there is a particularity to people's context that is each of us making our own way quite differently in the world. And for a church to try, I think, to just offer generically, like we just sort of do generic church, it's just church. Yeah. It's not going to work for next church. So Galileo has gotten very specific and really particular. And if people say, yeah, but I don't like that thing you do, or I wish you did this instead, I say, you know what? There are some churches who do that instead. And you can totally go there, and it's totally fine. It's really fine. So there's that. And then I think next church will have a really light infrastructure. It will pivot quickly because that particularity shifts. So the church needs to be light and be able to shift. So none of these multi-page constitutions and bylaws that bind us to certain ways of being, the lightness of that, so that it can be fast and transparent about decision-making, about power, where it rests, who has it, how it gets used, transparency in that. People younger than myself demand it and will not invest in any structure that they feel is not transparent and truthful to them. That's
a great point you have about the deeply contextual. I don't know if you see this down in Texas, but in my neck of the woods, it seems like the mainline Protestant churches will they'll raise a rainbow flag and say, hey, we're LGBT affirming, and just kind of be like, hey, when's everybody going to show up? And it rarely works. And I think it speaks to what you're saying is there has to be something you're offering those people that's relevant to their lives.
That's and that somehow, I mean, we at Galileo, we call them missional priorities. We have 5 of them. They're very specific. They're on the front page of the website. We recite them, not like in a creedal way, but I mean, they get said every Sunday of the world. So by the time you've been there 3 or 4 Sundays, you know this is what this church does. And I think that very particular combination of missional priorities is what makes us us. We would never say that any other church should have those same missional priorities. I'm glad that other churches have different ones. But if the priorities that we've named have resonance in your heart, it may be that those are your missional priorities too. And wouldn't that be something if you could come sort of, journey together with people who are leaning in the same direction with you?
That's a great point you bring up. And I was going to ask you this, how can this help an established pastor? And my thought is that just saying your priorities each week would go a long way to an established church. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think in the first place, the established church, an established congregation has to get clear about what its missional priorities actually are.
Right.
And I mean, what do you actually exist for in the world? If you disappeared, who would miss you?
Mm-hmm.
If you disappeared, what work of God's big agenda would not be getting done in the place that you are? Like, you got to get super clear about that. And you have to make sure that your budget backs that up. I mean, I think if people from the outside of some of our congregations read our budget like the story that it is, they would say the missional priorities of this church are to keep up property and pay personnel, because that's where we spend all of our money.
Yeah.
And that's where we spend all of our time. Like, if you just read through the minutes of a
board meeting,
right? Where are we spending our energy and resources to keep up property and manage personnel? Well, nobody's excited about that. That's not the gospel. That isn't saving
No
anybody.
one wants to give to a building.
No. So what does your church really exist for? And I think partly in an effort to be kind to everyone and what sort of everybody's interested in. I've definitely served in churches where the outreach budget was simply spent on, we just wrote checks to 30 different organizations.
Yeah.
They were the 30 that people had mentioned in the last few years, and we've always written checks to these 30, and that's really it. And if somebody wanted another one, we'd add 31, and we just divvy up the money, and that's what we do. But there's no real deep engagement of our hearts in any of that.
That's great. Tell me, because I want to hear, if I can, because I know you've got a building to pay, I guess. I'm guessing. You probably got staff people on payroll. Is it about telling a story? Is it about your narrative of your budget? Because I'm guessing you have many similar expenses that an established church has. So how does that look different for you at Galileo, and how might that translate to an established church?
Yeah, we do have many of the same expenses. That's right. I would say places where we aren't spending a lot of money are on the property, because we don't own it. We rent a corrugated sheet metal barn. I could not make that up if I tried. And the landlord keeps it in basic repair, but any improvements we want to do, we just do ourselves. And so there's a real kind of DIY attitude around the property. And it's not the cleanest place you've ever been. It's not brightly lit. It's, but it is exactly what it's supposed to be for us.
Yeah.
And we don't really own any property, so our liability insurance is quite low. We pay the right insurance for people who rent property, and it just doesn't cost us much. Big churches that have big facilities they're writing big checks to insurance companies. In fear of a lawsuit or whatever. But and then in terms of personnel, I'm full time on staff, but I'm the only full timer. We pay other people part-time salaries for their little niche part of the work. I wish that were not the case. I wish we could pay them a whole living wage for the incredible gifts they bring to us. So I have some regrets around that. But here's what we've done. We are telling a different story about that money, about those resources. Our budget, which is on our website, is broken down into categories of Jesus's own ministry. And so, because we figure if Jesus didn't do it, then the body of Christ probably shouldn't be doing it. So the first thing in our budget is announcing the reign of God and inviting people in.
Ooh.
So under that, we throw parties, we're in parades, we print up stuff, we pay for our website, all that announcing and inviting stuff that we do to say the reign of God looks like this and you are invited in. That's first. And then next is preaching and teaching, healing and feeding, eating and drinking with friends. That's like a whole category in our budget, because that's something Jesus did so much. They said he was a glutton and a drunkard, right? So we want to eat and drink with friends. So there's a lot of money for food in our budget. Welcoming children is a big part of, right? Jesus did that in the Gospels. There's just all these things, right? So we've divided those categories out, and sorry, my phone was interrupting me there. And then we can take things like the rent for the barn, and that can actually be applied toward worship, right? Worship and spirituality, and eating and drinking with friends. It can be parsed out on all these things we do that Jesus did. Same with my salary, which is the big expense in our budget. Actually, can be divided out among all the different ways that I support these actions, this way of life that we're trying to do together.
Hey, this is such an important point, I think, that I want listeners to get. I remember I tried to do this my first church, I took like our terrible mission statement, and I took like the previous week's board minutes or previous month's board minutes, and like highlighted them to each section that correlated, I thought, to the mission statement, just to try to get this point across that everything we're doing needs to fit into part of our mission statement. And I think I love the way you're saying it, and I think it's such an important point that even older established churches can take from that. Each item of your budget doesn't need to be a boring item, and it reflects your ongoing ministry. And I love that you're pointing that out.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you for that. Tell me real quick, we'll kind of take a break after this.
Okay.
And tell me what maybe spiritual practice you've developed through the years, or that you've developed among your church folk that you'd recommend to others.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's serving us best now during the pandemic is a practice actually that we've been working on together as a church for all the years of our life together. And that is the practice of narrating our lives to each other, like telling our own stories, spiritual autobiographies, as part of God's large and ongoing story of the world. My story is a part of God's story, and learning to tell my life that way is important. And it requires an accompanying spiritual practice of listening to people's testimony and believing what they tell you. Wow. Sort of dual thing. And as we learn to narrate, to tell each other about our lives, and to listen to each other and believe while we listen, that grows into this deepening of relationship and a strength of bond that we could never make only by sitting in worship together, or or only by serving in a food pantry together, or whatever. It really turned toward each other.
This was certainly a tradition in my Baptist circles growing up, and I'm curious if it was the same for you in the Church of Christ, this testimony time?
No.
Oh, okay.
We did all head, no heart.
All head, no heart. That's interesting.
We knew the Baptists were out there emoting over stuff. We just weren't doing that. Fascinating. Yeah, the power of story and sharing our stories with one another is such a vulnerable, grace-filled endeavor. So, well, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back for some closing questions. Okay.
All right, we're back with Reverend Dr. Katie Hayes. Katie, some closing questions you can take as seriously or not as you'd like to. Okay. Tell me, if you were Pope for a day, what is your big thing?
If I were Pope for a day, I would write a papal encyclical declaring that patriotism is a sin.
Wow.
The fragmentation of the human family.
Wow.
That's it.
That's big time. Okay.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. So this is maybe is a good follow-up question. Like, what theologian or Christian figure would you cite in that?
Well, probably Walter Brueggemann has been most influential to me in thinking about the danger of nationalistic borders, just the falseness of imposing borders on the world that God has made. Ellen Davis, some Hebrew Bible scholars in particular who have thought about Israel's own national identity and the appropriation of that for American Christian patriotism, like Christo-patriotism, which is very strange and scary to me.
Yeah. Tell me, I'm sure you're familiar with Phyllis Tickle, I imagine.
Yes, quite.
There's an evangelical guy, Brady Shear, who kind of talks in similar type language about social media and the internet being like the biggest change in communication in 500 years. Kind of in that way of thinking, what would you say history will remember this current time and place for?
Yeah, I think that social media and the internet generally has led to an expanded worldview for almost all of us. I mean, the world is just a lot bigger than we thought. Yeah. At least I can remember when it was not this big. We didn't have access to it all. And that expanded worldview meant that we all sort of, like all across the world, we became aware of each other in new ways. And I think what remains to be seen is whether, having become aware of each other, the whole human family, sort of looking at each other now, do we like each other? Will we love each other?
Wow.
Enough to dissolve borders and boundaries and actually work in concert with each other, or for a more dystopian future,
Yeah.
having now seen each other,
Wow.
do we now realize that we don't really like each other or trust each other or care very much about each other's well-being?
Well, that's a book right there, I think, Katie.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Well, I think you're hinting at it right there in your answer, but do you have a guess of what Christianity will look like then in 500 years?
I'm hoping that within the next half millennium, we discover that there's life apart from life on Earth, sentient life even, not just on this planet. And oh my gosh, I hope that we have the most curious, spiritual explorers who want to go there, wherever it is, and just listen to the stories that those sentient beings have been telling, their own stories of origin, about how the world came to be, about how it was broken, and about what it would take to redeem it, to repair it.
Wow, that's a whole nother podcast right there. That's another book right there, Katie. Wow.
Oh, people have written that book, and
have they?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, like that book, we've all read it, The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell.
Okay, I'm going to check that out.
Sci-fi about a future where only the Vatican has money anymore for space travel and exploration, because the Earth has kind of come undone. And so they agree to fund an exploratory trip to a new planet if they can put a Jesuit on the excursion. And they send this amazing priest out to meet these sentient beings and to report back, like, what is it going to take to convert them to Christianity? But the open question is, like, do they need, I don't know, do they need Christianity as we know it? Or maybe they have their own stories of creation, fall, redemption.
Wow.
You should listen first.
Yeah, that's a good lesson here for us to end on.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Tell our listeners where they can find out more about you.
I am torn about how to answer that. I actually have a website. It's pretty new to me. I've never had anything like that before, but I sort of needed it because I have a book.
Yeah.
So Katie Hayes, no E in Hayes.net is that. I will say, though, that if you really want to know what I'm doing day to day, where my heart really is and what I'm engaged in, Galileo Church on all the socials, including TikTok, where we have 180 followers as of today. We're very excited.
Yeah, speaking of new, right?
Right, yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Thanks, Katie, so much. And appreciate you taking some time out of your schedule. And peace be with you and your community during this time of the pandemic and all. So
thank you, Lauren. Peace of Christ to you and all your beloveds. Take care.
All right.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. But hey, before you go, do us a favor, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.